Some time ago, I was in Cashwise, the grocery store sort of across town, and I struck up a conversation with the clerk, as one does in St. Cloud at the Cashwise. When she learned that I taught history, she said, "Oh, that must be so boring." Okay, well, I laughed. I was wounded, I will admit, just in the slightest wounded, but I was also really sympathetic. She hated history. I wonder if some of you might have hated history. I certainly did when I was in grade school and high school. Too much memorization, too many dates, too many important men doing important things, and nothing that had anything to do with me. All right? But a revolution has taken place in the teaching and writing of history. It's one that's left some people in despair and quite worried about our future, but it's left others of us, like me, transformed and thrilled. Those traditional historians often believed and aimed to teach patriotism by teaching history. So they wanted to emphasize what was good and what was worthy. People like me, people of my ilk, as we're sometimes called, we like to teach probing analysis and really sustained reflection, particularly self-reflection. Is for me, everything about history has to do with us, and everything has to do with the present. So these two different aims that the traditional historians and the contemporary historians have take us in very different directions, in very different paths, through different source materials, through different questions, and with different methods. I want to give you two examples of the kind of history that I do. I want to start with this guy, Henry Sibley. Henry Sibley, oh, I have spent so much time trying to understand this man. Henry H. Sibley came to the Minnesota River Valley in the 1830s. He was hired by the American Fur Company to be the agent at Mendota. He accepted the job, and he was hired in part because he spoke French, because he was from Detroit, and French, yeah. French was the language of the fur trade, so it made sense for him to come. And he came with such enthusiasm. He learned the Dakota language very quickly after he arrived. He made friends. He had a daughter by a Dakota woman named Red Blanket Woman. He published accounts of his experiences in the Minnesota River Valley under the name Hal, a Dakota. So clearly he was identified and identifying and connecting with these people who he was now with. By 1858, he had a white wife. He was governor of the new state of Minnesota, and he had made a fortune in large part through fraudulent and duplicitous Indian treaties, from which he benefited personally. Okay. In 1862, he was called up to lead U.S. troops against Dakota people in the U.S.-Dakota War, and he conducted trials in the field at the end of that war that resulted in the hanging of 38 in Mankato late in 1862. He went on to become president of the Minnesota Historical Society, and he helped found the University of Minnesota. Okay, I ask you, what do you do with a guy like that? If I try to understand him only intellectually, I'm not ever going to get any place. Because it was clear that he wasn't a man who moved from point A to point B to point C logically and reasonably and rationally, Something else was happening. So I look at Sibley and I think he was such a complex and troubled and ambitious and greedy man, and he did still help found the University of Minnesota, and he was still the first governor of Minnesota. It seems to me that if I allow him to be as complex as all of those facets make him, then the past itself can be more complex. And once it is, it can be more trustworthy for us to look at it and to look for lessons. The second thing that Sibley takes me to is a pretty searching self-analysis. Looking at him makes me wonder, what are my complexities? What are the places where my ambition may get in the way of my kindness or my good sense? What am I blind to, and what am I blinding myself to? So by looking at Sibley, I learned something about him. I learned something about the dynamics of early white Minnesota history, and I learned something about myself. It's learning worth doing. My second example are these two women. Oh, I love these women. This is Clara and Martha Steen outside the cook tent at this timber camp outside of Bemidji. There were women like this cooking in timber camps, it turns out, across northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, probably upstate Washington and upstate New York. The women did the cooking often in these camps. Now, these are not conventionally important women. I don't even know very much about them. What you can find in Ancestry.com, what I can find in birth records and death records. They're not people who left any accounts of themselves. So I need to try and imagine their lives. Well, so Martha on the right is 19, Clara is 16. I want to call them women, but really they're girls. Right? They're Norwegian Americans. They're both born in the United States, of a Norwegian father and a Norwegian American mother who, really, I tell you, they're Ole and Lena. Okay, really, truly. All right. They worked in these camps for a little while. They took a variety of other jobs. Martha married when she was 20. Martha married in 1920. Clara married in 20 or 21. I'm not quite sure. Martha lived until 1991, and Clara until 1983. So when we think about the changes that we have experienced in our lives, I want us to think about Martha and Clara and how you go from being born in 1905 to dying in 1983 or 1991. This picture was taken in 1917. 1917, I have to tell you, was a hell of a year. The Russian Revolution happened in 1917. World War I was happening in 1917. There was labor agitation in the iron mines and, in fact, in these timber camps, in factories. There was agitation. It felt in much of the United States as if we were in the midst of turmoil. I recognize something of that. How did they respond? What did they experience? I mostly have questions to ask of them, but what I find is that looking at them doesn't really help me. But what does is I walk around and try and stand behind them, look over their shoulders, and look at the world that they saw. When they are looking out in this picture, what do they see in these woods that they're looking at? And, or more, what do they see in their own futures? What do they imagine for themselves? What does it mean to them to be Norwegian American? Do they even think about being a Norwegian American? Are they in the camps because maybe their brother has already been called up into the service, and so their family needs more money? Who knows? I don't know for certain the answer to most of these questions, but I do know that by asking them, I get practice in seeing the world through other people's points of view. I think I increase my capacity to understand other people, and I think I learn empathy from the process. Well, there are two other aspects of this photo that I'm particularly interested in. One is it's a photo. And I don't know about you, but I have composed many photos in my life that I hoped that somebody would believe were real. Right? You know, you go out. One of my favorites is, tipping the camera so that no wires go across your picture, or arranging it so that those 500 other people who were looking at the geysers in Yellowstone Park aren't visible, and it looks like it's just me and Old Faithful. And isn't that great, right? And I don't even Photoshop. If you do Photoshop, you can do a whole lot more. But this makes me wonder, who took this picture? And what's the story? Who's the photographer? And write more information down on photos that you take. Right? It's killing historians like me that we don't know more about this. Now, I presume that Clara and Martha didn't hire a photographer. Right? Though there were many itinerant photographers who were traveling around the country who could well have taken one of these pictures. So it seems more likely that the timber company hired them. And then, what were they trying to do with that photo? Right? Were they trying, maybe it was for a recruitment poster, and they wanted, maybe we'd like to have more women, or maybe we'd like to recruit more men, or maybe we'd like to reassure the parents of the girls who were going to come, look at what a nice place this is. Right? So every photo you look at, think about, how does this photo lie? What are the gaps in what we can know? And how might it be a recreation of somebody's version of reality rather than reality itself? The other thing that interests me about this photo is that in looking at it, I see that I have changed. When I looked at it 10 years ago, I was particularly taken, first with my surprise that these women were in this camp. Second, by Clara's frilly serving apron versus Martha's substantial cook's apron. Also that Gabriel horn, right? Apparently they really used those horns to call men in to come for meals. So there were lots of tantalizing, interesting things to me about the photo. But now, I wonder how safe they felt. These two women in this camp with dozens of men. Were they safe? Were they afraid? How did they fend for themselves? Was somebody around to defend them? Right, and once I introduced sort of the question of sexuality, first, the students get way more interested, I'll tell you that. But introducing the issue of sexuality, then I start to wonder about those men in the camp. I wonder if there are any gay men. And if they were, what was their experience? So, I've spent my life studying topics like this and in this way. I've spent my career trying to help people experience history in a different way. If that cash-wise clerk were here someplace, if you're here, raise your hand, right? If she were here someplace, I would say, history has everything to do with you. Don't let anybody take it away from you. Don't let anybody persuade you that you are not important. Because, in fact, we all are historical artifacts. And we all carry our history in us and on us. If you don't believe me, look at your lifetime of shoes, right? Or your lifetime of dresses. Dresses, or maybe you don't all wear dresses, but the dress that you might have worn 20 years ago, or the hairstyle that you had 20 years ago that you don't have anymore. That history is in us. I also see it in my hand. It looks more and more like my mother's hand as I age. Or this little cowlick that that's exactly like my dad's cowlick. So I carry the history in that way. But more importantly, I carry the history in my head, in my ideas, in my attitudes, and perhaps most crucially, in things that feel inevitable or natural, or this is how this has to be. Whenever you feel that, take that as a clue that you are in a particular time and place that's teaching you particular things about marriage, about religion, about going to school, about what it means to be a woman, about what it means to be a man. We live within definitions in our time. If that clerk were here, and if you're here, raise your hand again. If you're here, I would say bring your entire being to thinking about history. It's not enough to think about it. You also have to feel about it. You have to use your intuition. You have to use your emotion. You have to feel your way into the past. Well, this is the kind of history that I think collectively we need. I think it's the kind that we need to make room for. It's the kind that we need to foster in our schools. Okay? We need to empower people, and history can empower people not to memorize dates, not to uphold a fragile patriotism covered with secrets or half-truths, but to live more engaged, thoughtful, and meaningful lives. We need history that is more authentic, trustworthy, life-giving, and I would say life-changing. And may it be so. Thank you.